The flames had already claimed the roof when Silas Boone first spotted the smoke rising from Confederate Ridge. Orange tongues licked hungrily at the log cabin's weathered walls, sending black plumes spiraling into the pale afternoon sky like a death signal across Dry Fork Valley. His horse's hooves thundered against the rocky ground as he spurred the animal harder, his weathered face grim with determination. The cabin sat isolated on the ridge a mile from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by nothing but sagebrush and rattlesnake country. Silas had ridden this territory for over a decade, managing his cattle herd in solitude. But he'd never seen this homestead burn before. The acrid smell of burning wood and something else, something that made his stomach turn, filled his nostrils as he dismounted and rushed toward the inferno. The front door hung askew burning timber, scattered across the threshold like broken bones. Without hesitation, Silas kicked the debris aside and plunged into the smoke-filled interior. The heat struck him like a physical blow, searing his lungs and making his eyes water until he could barely see. But through the haze, he heard a child's terrified coughing coming from somewhere deeper in the cabin. Following the sound, Silas stumbled through the chaos until he found a small pantry door, its wood already beginning to char. Inside, huddled against sacks of flour and preserved goods, was a boy of perhaps 6 years old. His face was streaked with soot, his small body shaking with each violent cough that racked his lungs. "Come on, son," Silas rasped, scooping the child into his arms. "We're getting out of here." The boy's arms wrapped around Silas's neck as they fought their way back through the burning cabin. Timber groaned overhead, and Silas knew they had seconds before the entire structure collapsed. He burst through the doorway just as a beam crashed behind them, sending sparks flying like angry fireflies into the dusty air. As Silas set the boy down gently on a patch of clear ground, his boot struck something metallic, half buried in the dirt. Through the smoke and chaos, he glimpsed the distinctive ivory grip of a Colt revolver, one he recognized with a shock of recognition. The initials JB were carved into the handle, along with a small cross that Jacob had etched there after their father's death. It was impossible. This gun had been Jacob's most prized possession, buried with him 10 years ago, according to the undertaker. Silas's hands trembled as he picked up the weapon, his mind reeling with impossible implications. But there was no time to process the discovery. The child was coughing violently, both of them gasping for clean air as the cabin collapsed completely behind them. "You're safe now," Silas said, his voice hoarse as he knelt beside the boy. "What's your name, son?" The child looked up at him with eyes that seemed far too old for his young face. His lips moved, forming words that were barely audible above the crackling timber. "Your brother," the boy whispered. The words hit Silas like a bullet to the chest. His vision blurred, not from smoke this time, but from the impossible shock of what he'd just heard. His knees gave out, and he collapsed beside the boy, his mind reeling with implications that couldn't be true, couldn't be possible. Jacob Boone had been dead for 10 years. Silas had watched them lower the coffin into the ground himself. Sat up, Silas Boone had not always been a recluse. 42 years old now, with graying temples and hands scarred from a decade of solitary ranch work, he could still remember a time when he'd been part of the community in Dry Fork Valley. That was before the hanging. Before Judge Sutherland had destroyed everything Silas held dear with a corrupt gavel and a fabricated murder charge. His brother Jacob had been 3 years younger, quick with a smile, and quicker with his gun when justice needed serving. Jacob had worked as a deputy marshal in town, earning respect from honest folks and hatred from the criminal element that Judge Sutherland secretly protected. When a prominent merchant named Cornelius Webb was found shot dead in his store, Jacob had been investigating the judge's connection to illegal land seizures. The timing was no coincidence. The trial had been a mockery. Witnesses appeared from nowhere, swearing they'd seen Jacob leaving Webb's store with blood on his clothes. Evidence materialized that hadn't existed during the initial investigation. Judge Sutherland himself presided over the proceedings, his face a mask of righteous indignation as he condemned Jacob to hang for murder. Silas had tried everything, hiring lawyers, gathering his own evidence, even appealing to the territorial governor. Nothing worked. The corruption ran too deep, the fix was in. And Jacob Boone swung from the gallows on a cold October morning, while his older brother watched helplessly from the crowd. That day had broken something fundamental inside Silas. He'd sold his house in town, moved to a remote ranch on the valley's edge, and cut all ties with civilized society. If the law could murder an innocent man in broad daylight, then the law meant nothing. Better to live alone with the cattle and the coyotes than trust any human being again. But losing Jacob hadn't been his only torment. 3 months after the execution, his fiancée, Mary Carson, had been killed in what officials called a stagecoach accident on the mountain pass. Her body was never recovered, and they said the coach had plunged into a ravine during a storm, and the river had swept away the wreckage. In the span of 1 terrible year, Silas had lost both his brother and the woman he'd planned to marry. For 10 years, Silas had maintained his isolation, riding the rugged perimeter of the valley to tend his herd and avoid human contact. He traded with traveling merchants for supplies, kept his interactions brief and businesslike, and nursed his double burden of loss in solitude. The only things that brought him to town were absolute necessities, and even then he stayed just long enough to conduct his business before returning to the wilderness. On this particular afternoon, he'd been checking on a small group of steers near Confederate Ridge when he'd spotted the smoke. The homestead had been built recently within the last few years, from what he could tell. But he'd never bothered to learn who lived there. Neighbors meant complications, and complications meant pain. But a burning building with potential victims was different. Whatever his feelings about humanity in general, Silas couldn't ignore someone in mortal danger. He'd ridden hard across the treacherous terrain, expecting to find a family in need of rescue from an accidental fire. He hadn't expected to find his dead brother's gun or hear impossible words from a child's lips. Inciting incident. What do you mean? Silas demanded, his voice cracking with emotion he hadn't felt in years. Jacob's revolver felt impossibly heavy in his hand, the metal still warm from the heat of the burning cabin. What do you mean, your brother? The boy wiped his nose with the back of his soot-stained hand, leaving another dark smear across his face. Despite his obvious terror and exhaustion, there was something steady in his gaze that reminded Silas painfully of Jacob. My papa. The boy said, his voice stronger now that they were away from the smoke. My papa is Jacob Boone. He told me all about you, Uncle Silas. He said if anything ever happened to him and Mama, I should find you and tell you who I was. Silas felt the world tilting beneath him. That's impossible. Jacob is dead. I saw them bury him. No, sir. The boy shook his head emphatically. Papa said they made everyone think he was dead, but he got away. He said Judge Sutherland tried to kill him for something bad the judge did, but Papa's friends helped him escape. He's been living here with Mama and me, but he calls himself Tobias Rigg now, so the bad men won't find us. The name meant nothing to Silas, but the boy's conviction was absolute. And the gun in his hand was undeniable proof this was Jacob's weapon. Jacob's initials, Jacob's distinctive cross carved into the ivory grip. Either this child had been fed an elaborate lie, or the impossible was true. Where is he now? Silas asked, though he dreaded the answer. Fresh tears spilled down the boy's cheeks. Still inside. He and Mama were fighting the fire, trying to save our important papers. Mama put me in the pantry and told me to stay hidden no matter what. I heard her screaming, then Papa yelling, then everything got quiet, except for the burning. Silas turned to look at the cabin, which was now completely consumed. The walls had buckled inward, and what remained of the roof had collapsed into the interior. If anyone was still inside, they were beyond help. But if there was even a chance, stay right here, Silas commanded, lurching to his feet and tucking Jacob's gun into his belt. "Don't move from this spot." The boy grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "Don't go back in there, Uncle Silas. The bad men might still be watching." "Bad men?" Silas froze. "You mean this wasn't an accident?" "No, sir. Papa saw them coming up the ridge with torches. That's why he and Mama were trying to get our papers out of the house. Papa said Judge Sutherland's men found us and we had to run." The revelation hit Silas like ice water in his veins. This wasn't a rescue from a tragic accident. It was the aftermath of an assassination attempt. And if Jacob really was alive, if he really was trapped in that inferno, then Silas was about to lose his brother all over again. First obstacle, Silas charged toward the ruins of the cabin with desperate determination. But the structure had deteriorated rapidly in the few minutes since he'd emerged with the boy. The doorway was completely blocked by fallen debris, and heat radiated from the wreckage like standing too close to a blacksmith's forge. He circled the collapsed building, looking for any gap in the destruction. But the walls had caved inward, and the roof timbers had fallen in a tangled mass of burning wood. His shirt began to smoke from the proximity to the heat, and he had to back away repeatedly to keep from being singed. Through the crackling and popping of burning wood, he thought he could hear voices inside, faint calls for help that made his heart race with desperate hope. But when he pressed closer, straining to listen, he realized the sounds were just the settling of debris and the hiss of sap boiling out of pine logs. Jacob," he shouted at the top of his lungs. "Jacob, can you hear me?" Only the roar of the fire answered him back. Silas felt a crushing weight of despair settle over him as the reality became inescapable. If Jacob and his wife had been inside when the structure collapsed, they were dead. There was no question about it, no hope for miraculous survival. He returned to where the boy, his nephew, apparently was sitting in the dirt, tears cutting clean tracks through the soot on his face. Silas knelt beside him, his own eyes wet with tears he hadn't shed since Jacob's supposed execution. "I'm sorry," he whispered, pulling the child against his chest. "I'm so sorry, son. I tried." The boy sobbed against his shoulder, and Silas felt the full weight of responsibility settling on him. This child had just lost both parents in the most horrible way imaginable. And now he was looking to an uncle he'd never met for protection and comfort. But even as he held the grieving boy, Silas's mind was working through the implications of what he'd learned. If Jacob had really survived his execution and lived in hiding for 10 years, if Judge Sutherland's men had tracked him down and murdered him along with his wife, then this wasn't over. The same corruption that had destroyed Silas's family a decade ago was still operating, still killing innocent people to protect its secrets. This time, though, there was a witness. And this time Silas wouldn't stand by helplessly while justice was denied. Rising action. As the cabin burned to its foundation, Silas lifted the boy onto his horse and began the ride toward town. The child, who introduced himself as Eli during their slow journey, gradually shared his story between bouts of coughing that worried Silas deeply. According to Eli, his father Jacob had indeed been saved from the gallows through an elaborate deception. 3 men, a doctor, a minister, and a sympathetic guard, had arranged for Jacob to be drugged rather than hanged, then smuggled out of town in a coffin with air holes. The hanging had been real enough to fool the crowd, but Jacob had been unconscious, not dead. Papa said it was the only way to prove Judge Sutherland was lying. Eli explained, his small voice hoarse from smoke inhalation. He needed time to find evidence that the judge was stealing people's land and killing anyone who got in his way. Jacob had fled south, initially working on cattle drives and in mining camps under assumed names, while his allies gathered information about Sutherland's crimes. After 2 years, when the immediate heat had died down, he'd returned to the valley using the identity of Tobias Rigg, a supposed newcomer from Colorado. "He built our cabin on the ridge because it was far from everyone," Eli continued. "That's where he met my Mama Mary. She was hiding too from something bad that happened to her." The mention of the name stopped Silas cold. Mary. What was her last name before she married your father? Carson, Eli replied without hesitation. Mary Carson. Papa said she used to know you, that you were going to be married before the bad things happened. Silas felt his world tilt once again. Mary Carson, his Mary, his lost fiancée, who'd supposedly died in a stagecoach accident. The woman whose death had been the final blow that drove him into isolation. She wasn't really dead. Eli explained, sensing his uncle's shock. Mama told me the story lots of times. She said Judge Sutherland's men came to her house the night before she was supposed to give testimony about Papa's case. They told her if she testified, they'd kill her and make it look like an accident. So she ran away and let everyone think she died in that stagecoach crash. The pieces fell into place with painful clarity. Mary had been prepared to testify on Jacob's behalf, to provide evidence that might have saved him from the gallows. But Sutherland's threats had silenced her, forced her to choose between speaking the truth and staying alive. She'd chosen survival, and in doing so had been forced to abandon both the men she cared about. She found Papa after he came back from hiding. Eli continued. They fell in love and got married, and then I was born. But Mama always said she felt bad about leaving you, that she wished she could tell you the truth, but it was too dangerous. As they neared the outskirts of Dry Fork Valley, Silas felt a cold rage building in his chest that dwarfed anything he'd experienced during Jacob's original arrest. Sutherland hadn't just murdered his brother and stolen his fiancée. He'd systematically destroyed 3 lives to protect his criminal empire. And now he'd killed Mary and Jacob in truth, orphaning their son and leaving Silas to pick up the pieces once again. But this time would be different. This time Silas had Jacob's gun a living witness and nothing left to lose. Midpoint twist. They stopped at Willow Creek to rest the horse and treat Eli's injuries with cool water. The boy had been coughing less frequently, but Silas was still concerned about the damage to his small lungs. As he wet his bandana in the stream to clean soot from Eli's face, the child reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Mama gave me this when she put me in the pantry, Eli said. She told me if something happened to her and Papa, I should give it to you. Silas unfolded the paper carefully, trying not to damage the edges that had been singed by the fire. It was a letter in Mary's careful handwriting, the ink slightly smeared, but still legible. Silas, it began, if you're reading this, then the worst has happened, and we're gone. I know you must hate me for the deception, for letting you believe I was dead all these years. But I want you to understand why I made the choices I did. The night before I was supposed to testify at Jacob's trial, 3 of Sutherland's men came to my house. They told me exactly what would happen. If I spoke up in court, they would kill me and make it look like an accident, just like they'd done to others who opposed the judge. I was young and scared, and I chose to run rather than fight. I let everyone think I died in that stagecoach accident because it was the only way to disappear completely. I knew it would hurt you terribly, but I thought you'd grieve for a while and then move on with your life. I never imagined you'd isolate yourself the way you did, or that my cowardice would cause you so much lasting pain. When Jacob returned under his false name, I recognized him, despite the beard and the years of hard living. We were both broken people trying to hide from the same monster, and we found comfort in each other's company. I won't apologize for falling in love with him, because he gave me hope when I thought I had none left. But I never stopped caring about you, never stopped regretting the pain my choices caused. Eli is our son, but in many ways, he's yours too. We raised him on stories of his uncle Silas, the brave man who tried to save his father and would have married his mother if the world had been different. If we don't survive Sutherland's latest attempt to silence us, please take care of our boy. He's all we have left to give you, and he needs someone strong enough to protect him from the darkness that destroyed our family. I hope someday you can forgive us both for the deception. We did what we thought was necessary to survive. but we never meant to leave you alone with your pain for so long. With love and regret, Mary. Silas read the letter twice, his hands shaking with a mixture of heartbreak and understanding. Mary's explanation didn't erase the pain of the lost years, but it helped him comprehend the impossible situation she'd faced. She'd been forced to choose between truth and survival, and like any rational person, she'd chosen to live. But the letter also revealed something else. Mary and Jacob had been planning for this possibility, preparing for the day when Sutherland would finally track them down. They'd known their secret life couldn't last forever, and they'd wanted to ensure their son would be protected when the reckoning came. Looking at Eli, who was watching him with those two wise eyes, Silas saw not just his nephew, but the child of the two people he'd loved most in the world. Whatever betrayal he felt about their deception, this boy was innocent. And according to Mary's letter, he was now Silas's responsibility. "Your mama was a good woman, Eli," Silas said softly, folding the letter and tucking it into his own pocket. "She made hard choices, but she always tried to do what was right." "She said you'd understand," Eli replied. "She said you were the strongest, kindest man she ever knew, and that's why she wanted you to take care of me if something happened." The trust in the boy's voice was humbling. Despite losing his parents in the most traumatic way possible, Eli was ready to put his faith in an uncle he'd just met. It was a responsibility Silas didn't take lightly. Second obstacle. As they prepared to continue toward town, Silas noticed dust clouds on the horizon behind them, riders approaching fast. His instincts, honed by years of solitary vigilance, told him this wasn't a coincidence. If Sutherland's men had burned the cabin to eliminate Jacob and Mary, they'd want to confirm their success. Finding survivors would be unacceptable. "We need to move," Silas told Eli, lifting the boy back onto the horse. "Hold on tight." But their mount was already tired from the hard ride to the fire, and carrying double-made speed impossible. The dust clouds were getting closer, resolving into individual riders, at least 4 men pushing their horses hard in pursuit. Silas's mind raced through their options. The main road to town offered no cover, and they were still miles from help. But there was an old mine shaft about half a mile south, hidden in a cluster of rocks that might provide temporary shelter. It was risky. Mines could be unstable, and they'd be trapped if the entrance was discovered, but it was better than being caught in the open. He turned off the road and urged his horse toward the rocky outcropping, hoping Eli could hang on for the rough terrain ahead. Behind them, he heard the thunder of hoofbeats growing louder, punctuated by distant shouts as their pursuers realized they'd been spotted. They reached the mine entrance just as the first shots rang out. Bullets whined off the rocks around them as Silas dismounted and grabbed Eli, diving for the shelter of the abandoned shaft. Their horse bolted, leaving them stranded but alive for the moment. "Stay down," Silas whispered, drawing Jacob's revolver and checking the cylinder. 6 shots and at least 4 men hunting them. Not good odds, especially with a child to protect. The mine shaft extended back into the hillside, far enough to hide them from view. But Silas knew it was also a trap, one way in, one way out. And their enemies knew exactly where they were. The air inside was stale and thick with decades of accumulated dust, making Eli cough again despite his efforts to stay quiet. "You in there, Boone?" a voice called from outside. Silas recognized the speaker, Tom Wickham, one of Sutherland's most trusted enforcers. "We know you got the boy. Send him out and maybe we'll make this quick for you." Silas pulled Eli deeper into the darkness, feeling along the walls for any side passages or escape routes. The mine had been abandoned for years, but the supports still seemed solid. Maybe there was another way out, some forgotten tunnel that connected to the surface. "The boy doesn't know anything." Silas called back, buying time while he explored their options. "Let him go, and you can have me." Wickham's laugh was ugly. "Nice try, but we know what his daddy was up to. Kids probably heard all kinds of interesting stories. Can't leave loose ends." More shots echoed in the mine shaft as the men outside tested angles and distances. Silas counted 4 distinct weapons, confirming his estimate of their numbers. He was outgunned and trapped with a traumatized 6-year-old depending on him for survival. "Uncle Silas." Eli whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm scared." "I know, son," Silas whispered back, putting his arm around the boy's shoulders. "But we're going to get through this. Your papa would want me to keep you safe, and that's exactly what I'm going to do." About 50 yards back into the mine, Silas's searching hands found what he'd been hoping for, a narrow side tunnel barely wide enough for a man's shoulders. It was an old ore chute, probably leading to a different level of the mine, or possibly to the surface. It was their only chance. "Eli, we're going to crawl through this tunnel," he whispered. "Stay right behind me and don't make any noise no matter what happens." The boy nodded, showing the same courage Silas remembered in Jacob. Together, they began working their way into the cramped passage, feeling their way through absolute darkness, while Wickham's men grew impatient outside. Climax. The tunnel was longer and more treacherous than Silas had hoped. Twice they had to squeeze through sections where the walls had partially collapsed and sharp rocks tore at their clothes and skin. Eli whimpered softly, but kept moving, following his uncle through the underground maze that might be their only hope for survival. Behind them, shouts and gunfire echoed through the mine, as Wickham's men discovered they'd fled deeper into the mountain. The sounds grew fainter as Silas and Eli worked their way through the cramped passage. But the knowledge that armed killers were hunting them made every scrape and stumble seem impossibly loud. A bullet ricocheted off the tunnel wall just inches from Silas's head, sending rock chips flying into his face. One of Wickham's men must have followed them into the side passage, firing blindly into the darkness. The muzzle flash briefly illuminated the tunnel, showing how close their pursuer had gotten. "Keep moving," Silas whispered to Eli, ignoring the warm trickle of blood running down his cheek where a rock fragment had cut him. "We're almost there." But even as he said it, he heard the ominous groaning of overstressed timber somewhere behind them. The gunfire was destabilizing the old mine supports, and sections of the tunnel were beginning to collapse. They had minutes, maybe less, before the entire passage caved in. They emerged into daylight just as a thunderous crash echoed from the mine entrance. Part of the main shaft had collapsed, trapping at least one of Wickham's men inside. Silas pulled Eli clear of the opening and looked around desperately for cover or escape routes. What he saw instead made his heart stop. 4 men on horseback were waiting for them, rifles trained on the mine's back entrance. But as the leader turned to face them, Silas felt his world shift once again. The face was older, scarred by weather and years of hard living, but unmistakable despite the full beard. It was Jacob Boone, alive, armed, and very much not dead in the burning cabin. "Oh, hello, brother," Jacob said quietly, lowering his rifle, as recognition dawned on both men simultaneously. "Sorry about the deception, but we needed Wickham to think we were dead." For a moment, Silas couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't process what he was seeing. Then Eli broke free from his grip and ran to his father, who caught him in a fierce embrace that left no doubt about their relationship. "Papa," Eli sobbed. "I thought you were dead. The cabin burned down and Uncle Silas tried to save you, but—" "I know, son," Jacob said softly, his voice thick with emotion as he held his child. "I'm sorry you had to go through that. But we had to make the bad men think we didn't survive so they'd stop hunting us." Over Eli's head, Jacob's eyes met Silas's with a mixture of joy, guilt, and desperate urgency. "Mary?" he asked, though he already knew the answer from Silas's expression. "She didn't make it out." Silas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I found her letter. I know everything now about the trial, about why she ran about you faking your death." Jacob's face crumpled with grief, but there was no time to process the loss. Gunfire erupted from the collapsed mine entrance as Wickham and his surviving men fought their way clear of the debris. The three men with Jacob rough-looking individuals Silas didn't recognize took cover behind rocks and began returning fire with practiced efficiency. "These are the men who helped me fake my death," Jacob explained quickly as bullets whined overhead. "Doc Morrison, Reverend Pike, and Deputy Collins. They've been gathering evidence against Sutherland for 10 years, waiting for the right moment to strike." One of the men, Collins, identifiable by his tarnished badge, called out a warning. "More riders coming from town. Looks like the judge sent his whole crew to clean this up." Silas counted at least 8 more men approaching at full gallop, all armed and riding hard. They were outnumbered 2 to 1, trapped in open ground, with a child to protect. Even if they won the fight, they'd still have to face Sutherland's corrupt influence in any legal proceedings that followed. But as the gunfight intensified, Silas found himself fighting beside the brother he'd mourned for 10 years, protecting the son of the woman they'd both loved. Despite everything, the deception, the lost years, the confusion and pain, he felt complete for the first time since Jacob's supposed execution. "There's a way out of this," Jacob shouted over the gunfire as he reloaded his rifle. "We've got enough evidence to hang Sutherland 10 times over, but we need to get it to the territorial marshal in Carson City. Collins sent a telegraph 3 days ago. Federal marshals should be on their way." A bullet shattered the rock inches from Silas's head, and he returned fire with Jacob's revolver, watching one of Wickham's men spin and fall. But their ammunition was running low, and more of Sutherland's men were arriving every minute. "We can't hold them off much longer." Doc Morrison called out, blood seeping through his shirt sleeve where a bullet had grazed him. Silas looked at Eli, who was pressed against a boulder with his hands over his ears, trying to block out the terrible sounds of battle. The boy had already lost his mother. He couldn't lose his father and uncle too, Jacob. Silas said, making a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. "Take Eli and get out of here. Head for the territorial road. If the marshals are coming, that's where you'll find them." "I'm not leaving you here," Jacob replied firmly. "One of us needs to survive to take care of that boy," Silas insisted. "And you're the one with the evidence Sutherland's trying to destroy. Go." Before Jacob could argue further, Tom Wickham appeared at the top of a rocky outcropping rifle aimed directly at Eli's hiding place. Time seemed to slow as Silas saw the man's finger tighten on the trigger, saw the deadly intent in his eyes. Without thinking, Silas threw himself between Wickham and the boy, feeling the bullet punch into his shoulder with numbing force. He went down hard, his vision blurring as shock and blood loss began to take their toll. But even as darkness crept in around the edges of his sight, he heard something that made his heart soar, at the distinctive call of a cavalry bugle growing louder by the second. The territorial marshals had arrived at last. Their timing couldn't have been better. Falling action. The gunfight ended quickly once Wickham and his surviving men realized they were facing federal troops. U.S. Marshal Henry Clayton led a full company of territorial marshals into the rocky clearing, their blue uniforms and professional bearing a stark contrast to Sutherland's ragtag crew of hired killers. Those who didn't surrender immediately were shot down as they tried to flee. Tom Wickham himself took a bullet through the leg and was captured alive, cursing and threatening revenge, until one of the marshals knocked him unconscious with a rifle butt. Doc Morrison, who'd spent 10 years waiting for this moment, immediately began treating Silas's shoulder wound while Jacob held Eli close and explained the situation to Marshal Clayton. Despite the blood loss and pain, Silas was conscious enough to hear his brother's testimony about Sutherland's crimes. "We have documented evidence going back 15 years, Jacob said, handing over a leather satchel he'd hidden in the rocks before the battle. "Land deeds, forged documents, witness statements, and a complete accounting of Judge Sutherland's criminal enterprises. Plus, we have living witnesses who can testify to murder, arson, and conspiracy." Clayton examined the documents with growing amazement and disgust. The corruption was even more extensive than the federal government had suspected, involving not just land theft and murder, but systematic embezzlement of territorial funds and conspiracy with known criminal gangs. Now this is enough to hang Sutherland and half his cronies, Clayton declared. But first, we need to deal with your legal status, Mr. Boone. According to our records, you've been dead for 10 years. Doc Morrison stepped forward, his arm in a makeshift sling, but his voice steady. Marshal, I can testify to the deception we used to save Jacob's life. We have signed statements from everyone involved, including the prison guard who helped smuggle him out in a coffin. Judge Sutherland was going to execute an innocent man, and we couldn't let that happen. Clayton had the authority to grant Jacob temporary immunity in exchange for his testimony against Sutherland. The judge would be arrested within the hour, his assets frozen, and his criminal network dismantled by federal forces. As the marshals organized their prisoners and prepared to ride back to town, Silas struggled to sit up despite his wounded shoulder. Jacob knelt beside him. Eli pressed close against his father's side. I should have told you, Jacob said quietly. After Mary and I got married after Eli was born, I should have found a way to let you know we were alive. The secret ate at us both, knowing you were out there alone, thinking we were dead. Silas looked at his brother's face, seeing the years of guilt and regret written there. You did what you had to do to survive. And you kept Mary safe, gave her a chance at happiness after everything she'd been through. I can't fault you for that. She never stopped loving you, Jacob said. Not the way she loved me, but you were always part of our family, even when you didn't know it. She made me promise that if anything happened to us, I'd tell you that. Eli looked up at both men with those wise eyes that reminded Silas so much of Jacob. Are you going to take care of me now, Uncle Silas, both of you together? Silas reached out with his good arm and pulled the boy close. That's exactly what we're going to do, son. You'll never be alone again. Resolution and final surprise. 6 months later, Judge Sutherland swung from the same gallows where Jacob Boone had supposedly died 10 years earlier. This time, there was no deception, no last-minute rescue, just justice finally served to a man who'd perverted the law for his own gain. Tom Wickham and his surviving accomplices received life sentences for murder and conspiracy. Jacob's name was officially cleared of all charges, his death certificate voided, and his property rights restored. The men who'd helped fake his execution were pardoned for their deception, having acted to prevent a greater injustice. The federal investigation revealed corruption so extensive that the entire territorial court system had to be restructured. Silas had testified at the trials, his decade of isolation making him a compelling witness to the judge's impact on innocent lives. But the real heroes were Jacob and Mary, who'd sacrificed everything to gather the evidence that finally brought down Sutherland's criminal empire. Now, as autumn painted Dry Fork Valley in shades of gold and crimson, Silas stood beside Mary's grave on a hill overlooking the peaceful community she'd helped save. Jacob had buried her there after the trials ended in a spot where she could see the valley she'd died protecting. The headstone was simple but elegant. Mary Carson Boone, beloved wife and mother. She chose truth over safety. Below that, in smaller letters, the bravest woman we ever knew. She would have liked seeing you again, Jacob said quietly, placing a bouquet of wildflowers beside the stone. Even at the end, when the cabin was burning, she kept saying she hoped you'd understand why we did what we did. Silas knotted his throat tight with emotion. He was still learning to express again. I do understand. It took me a while, but I do. She made the only choice she could, and so did you. Eli ran up the hill toward them, his face bright with the resilience of childhood. At 6 years old, he'd survived more trauma than most adults ever faced, but he was healing under the combined care of his father and uncle. The boy had insisted on living with both men, spending time at Jacob's rebuilt cabin and at Silas's ranch, creating the family that Mary had dreamed of but never lived to see. Uncle Silas. Eli called out. Papa says we can go fishing tomorrow if you want to come. He says you know the best spots in the whole valley. I'd like that, Silas replied, meaning it completely. Your mama always said the trout were biggest in autumn. As they walked back down the hill together, 3 generations of Boone men finally reunited. Silas felt something he hadn't experienced in 10 years, hope for the future. The corruption was gone, the truth had prevailed, and family bonds had proven stronger than death itself. Behind them, Mary Carson Boone rested in peaceful silence. Her sacrifice finally vindicated. The valley she'd died protecting was safe. Her son was loved and cared for, and the 2 men she'd loved most in the world had found their way back to each other. But as they reached the bottom of the hill, Jacob stopped suddenly and pulled something from his pocket, a small leather-bound journal that Silas hadn't seen before. "I almost forgot," Jacob said, his voice oddly hesitant. Mary kept a diary all these years. She wrote in it almost every day, and, well, a lot of it is about you. About the life she wished things could have been different, about how much she regretted the pain our deception caused. He held out the journal, his hands trembling slightly. "I wasn't sure if you'd want to read it, but it felt wrong to keep it from you. She wrote about wanting you to know that leaving wasn't about not loving you. It was about loving you enough to keep you safe from Sutherland's reach." Silas took the journal with reverence, feeling the weight of Mary's thoughts and feelings contained within its pages. It wouldn't bring her back, wouldn't change the past, but it might help him understand the woman who'd shaped so much of his life, through both her presence and her absence. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything. For surviving, for keeping her safe, for giving me a nephew to love, for making sure the truth finally came out." Jacob smiled, the first truly happy expression Silas had seen on his brother's face since their reunion. That's what family does. We protect each other no matter what it costs. As they headed home through the peaceful valley, Silas tucked Mary's diary safely inside his coat. Tonight, when Eli was asleep and the day's work was done, he would read her words and finally understand the full story of the love that had survived death, deception, and a decade of separation. The boy who'd whispered, "Your brother," in the ashes of a burning cabin, had brought not just shocking news, but redemption for an entire family. The end had indeed become a new beginning, just as Mary had always believed it would.